As you know, today we will be having a workshop, Institutional Ethnography, creating a genealogy of Latinx and Black, Indigenous, people of color faculty, as well as a genealogy of race, gender, and social justice curriculum across departments and programs. And we have VP Assata Zerai for the Division of Equity and Inclusion, who will start us off. And then co-presenting is also Ángeles Castorena, who is a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow, also graduating with a degree in sociology, and will be a doctoral student in sociology this fall at the University of California, Irvine. So we are extremely grateful to our co-sponsors, the Southwest Hispanic Research Institute, the Division of Equity and Inclusion, the Native American Faculty Council, UNM Africana Studies Department, the Department of Native American Studies, and the Department of Chicana and Chicano Studies. So before I turn it over to our co-presenters, I also wanted to acknowledge our co-chairs, and I'll let them present themselves. So Dr. Diane Torres Velasquez.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. So glad that so many people could join us this afternoon for this very, very important workshop. I am faculty in the College of Education in secondary education, and I really encourage you to join our network if you're not part of our alliance already. We have a lot of really important work to do and lots of fun getting to know each other. Thank you. And Veronica Garcia Zamora.
Hi, it's Gonzalez Zamora.
Gonzalez.
That's okay. There's a lot to remember. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm from the School of Law and junior faculty member. I'm super excited that Dr. Zerai is here, and we look forward to continuing the conversation after this workshop. So thank you all for being here.
Wonderful. So at this time, I'm going to invite VP Assata Zerai and Ángeles Castorena to introduce themselves and also lead us in this workshop. We're assuming that it will be about 30 to 40 minutes of presentation, and that rest of the time would be dedicated to questions people might have, and maybe even an opportunity to break out into smaller groups depending on how the conversation goes. So I will turn it over.
Here we go. Thank you so much. I'm going to, we're on a different slide than I expected. Let's see if I can get back. We're going to share the land acknowledgement statement and then ask Ruby to introduce herself. So sorry, just trying to get to the right slide. There we go. Founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. And we're very proud of the statement written by Pam Agoyo in collaboration with the Native American Faculty Council and adopted by President Stokes. So next I invite Ángeles to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Ángeles Ruby Castorena, but I go by Ruby. So as Dr. Lopez said, I am in my last year of undergrad, double majoring in sociology, women, gender, and sexuality studies. And I am currently a community capacity builder for the Community Engagement Center. And I also work as an intern for the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice. And this is my last year as a Mellon Mays Fellow, which I started my junior year. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruby. I'm just so happy to collaborate with you on this today. All right, back to sharing. So I am relatively new. I don't know if I can keep calling myself new. I've been here at UNM for 2 years, just about now. And I am a professor of sociology as well as vice president for equity and inclusion. And just so pleased to be here and speaking with you all today. As many of you know, I am professor emerita at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where I served for almost 20 years. And I'm a decolonial feminist scholar. And some of the presentation that I'll share with you today comes from some of the books that I've written and the many years of teaching qualitative methods. So our workshop objectives for today will be to introduce the Ethnography of UNM project that's hosted by the Division for Equity and Inclusion. And I'll just provide a very short overview of the grounding of institutional ethnography as a methodology in feminist, Chicanx, decolonial and Black feminist theories and frameworks. And then I'll tell you a little bit about the elements of institutional ethnographies in higher ed. And during that section, we will feature Ruby, who will discuss her project to collect race, gender, and social justice curricula across departments and programs at UNM. And then we'll end out our discussion with some examples of ethnographies in higher ed. And what I'm really excited about with this section is I'll not only tell you about some ethnographies, but some of the social justice actions that they stimulated, which is the purpose of ethnography. It's not about navel gazing. It's about, how do we understand our history? How do we understand our contexts so that we can design social change? And then finally, critical to achieving UNM's mission, we will explore some benefits of the Ethnography of UNM project for our institution. So we have a couple of ground rules that we like to share when we provide workshops. And thanks to Nancy Lopez and others in DEI who have helped us to delineate these ground rules. And so we ask that you embrace discomfort, because we often know that that's the space where learning can occur, and expect and accept non-closure. We ask for you to speak your truth and speak for yourself and use I statements when we get to the point of some interaction. We ask that you stay engaged to the ability to, as much as you can, because we know many of us are multitasking with kids at home and things like that. So we also ask that you maintain confidentiality, and anything shared here, we ask that you not share it out without that person's permission, and attack the problem and not the person. And then please practice active listening by sharing the mic. And then in terms of Zoom etiquette, we're really pleased to work with Academic Affairs to put this list together of Zoom etiquette, and it is on their website. We have a new Zoom bombing, website for how do you prevent Zoom bombing, and how do you respond when we have online attacks. And so you can find these recommendations there in terms of Zoom etiquette. So I'm not going to read all of them because we've been on Zoom a whole lot. So I'll just keep going because I think most of us are already aware. Oh, there are a couple of things I was asked to point out. So one, feel free to use the chat function. As a presenter, I must admit, I'm, especially if I'm driving the slides, I'm not likely to see the chat. So we have some facilitators that will help us with that. So feel free to share in the chat. But also know that if you send me directed questions, or Nancy or anyone else directed questions in the chat, that they aren't completely private, because once we download the chat, we'll see everything that's there. And the other thing is that, especially at the end when we get to our QA, if you have some questions that you would like to ask, but you're not really comfortable putting it in the chat for everyone to see, feel free to send that as a directed QA question or comment, and one of our facilitators will share that without sharing your name. Okay, and so next I am very pleased to introduce the Ethnography of UNM project. This is a project that we started back in, well, let me say we conceptualized back in the fall when we applied for some external funding to support the work of the project. And so after we unfortunately didn't receive that funding, we decided that we still really needed to do the project, that to have a better sense of the history of UNM, and in particular, the experiences of students, faculty, and staff of color at UNM was just really important for us. One, that, you know, any history of UNM would be incomplete without that information. And secondly, as I said before, we hope that this information will help us to spur some action. And just checking my notes here. And the other thing that happened around a little bit before the project got started is, of course, unfortunately, one of our faculty members was the target of a hate crime. And so back in summer of last year, we, DEI meaning, we hosted a town hall on anti-Black racism at UNM. And one of the results of that town hall is that we created a truth-telling commission working group that Kathy Powers is chairing. And so we felt that this part of truth-telling is understanding our history. And so you see on the slide here, I have an image of the Sankofa bird, which is an African Adinkra symbol from West Africa. And you see it says, go back and get it. That's not usually, those aren't usually the words I use to describe Adinkra, but I think it's a nice shorthand. And basically what the Adinkra stands for, you see it's a bird with his head turned backward, is that it's really important to know our history if we're going to chart a better future ahead of us. And also that it's very important for us to learn the lessons of history, learn from our mistakes in particular, so that we don't repeat them. And so we feel like that's a really nice image to represent ethnography of the University of New Mexico. And as I said before, the purpose is not just to learn our history, but to use liberating methodologies to analyze our experiences and then plan for our future. And so you didn't see my title slide because I jumped right in to the land acknowledgement statement, but the title, I kind of retitled the presentation to Ethnography of UNM, Exploring Liberating Methodology to Analyze Experiences of UNM BiPoc Faculty, Students, and Staff. And so because the word BiPoc was in there, I felt it was important for us to define what that means, because it's kind of a new term that's come into usage more, especially in the past year. I've noticed it used much more often. And so what some may not realize is that it stands for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Sometimes people leave the "and" out. And so that's to include, of course, our AAPI communities, in addition to Black and Indigenous communities, and also Latinx, Hispano, and Chicanx communities, as well as individuals that identify themselves as multiracial. And in our usage of BiPoc in DEI, it is really inherently intersectional. And so we include women, of course, persons with disabilities, and queer and trans folks. And it's really important also to recognize that these categories and identities within BiPoc communities are not exhaustive. And so others that may be included there would be tribal affiliation, first generation in the US, first generation in college, documentation status, and even the county in New Mexico. And, you know, we're talking about in our higher ed environment, so counties within New Mexico that are underrepresented at UNM, and much more. And so I wanted to tell you a little bit about the grounding of institutional ethnography. And so I want to point out a nomenclature difference here. So there is institutional ethnography as a particular framework for doing research, and that's going to be kind of the focus of the first part of my presentation. But then there are also ethnographies of institutions. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the broader ethnographies of institutions and then the narrow institutional ethnography as a theory. And so institutional ethnography as a methodology is grounded in feminist, Chicanx, decolonial, and Black feminist theories and frameworks. And it was developed by Dorothy Smith, who is a sociologist. And one of my very good colleagues, Marge DeVault, has really taken it to the next level in some of her work. Mary Romero, one of my mentors, is an individual who has used it quite a bit, and I've used it a little bit in some of my research. And so it's grounded in interpretive and phenomenological approaches, which are committed to looking at phenomenon from actors' own perspectives. So looking at those insider or emic perspectives that we talk about in qualitative methods is really critical to institutional ethnography. And as a critical feminist approach, it's been referred to as a liberating method. And actually, my friend Marge DeVault titled one of her books, Liberating Method. And the reason that these words are used to talk about it is because it is using scholarly insight in service of progressive social change. And so often within higher ed and within scholarship, research is kind of for the sake of research and for the sake of understanding the full experience of being human. And so this takes it a step beyond that to not just understanding the experience of being human, but using that information to help us to spur on progressive social change. And so IE is such a great methodology because it makes visible the ruling relations that shape the experiences of our students, faculty, and staff, and affected communities across institutions. And so by institutions, we mean broad institutions like the institution of education, the institution of policing, the institution of healthcare. And so the ways that those all work together, supplement one another, and how racialized experiences are similar across those various institutions. This method is also a tool to actively resist efforts to erase or conceal the histories of oppressed and subjugated people. And so you can imagine at the helm of DEI how this is very near and dear to my heart. And so in total, what I would kind of summarize this to say would be kind of the title of my slide here, that ethnographies and our UNM project will center BiPoc voices for a more complete and accurate narrative of the collective experiences of our students, faculty, and staff and affected communities at UNM. The other thing that informs is the fact that it really intentionally foregrounds our students, faculty, and staff who are quote unquote outsiders within UNM, which we'll talk more about in a second. And so one of the things that institutional ethnography challenges is the notion of value-free social science. And I'm just going to read this quote from feminist scholars Harding and Norberg. Dominant groups are especially poorly equipped to identify oppressive features of their own beliefs and practices, as standpoint methodologists have argued. Their activities in daily life do not provide them with the intellectual and political resources necessary to detect such values and interests in their own work. And so often we are told that particularly quantitative researchers, of which I am one, are approaching their work from this quote unquote value-free perspective. And what Harding and Norberg are arguing here is that there's really no such thing as value-free social science, that bias is part and parcel of all research. And they say that value-free research is not only unachievable because bias is ever present, but also they argue that it is undesirable. To have our values drive, our values for social justice, to drive our motivations for research, they argue, and as do many others, is highly valuable. And also to hold ourselves accountable to disadvantaged groups is a valuable endeavor. So institutional ethnography is a practice that posits an alternative to the distance, distorting, and dispassionately objective procedures of much social research. And it really seeks to bring women in terms of coming from a feminist perspective. And as a Black feminist, I would say to bring in the experiences of women and people of color, to bring in the experiences of our queer and trans communities, to bring in the experiences of our persons with disabilities. So to bring in all of those marginalized identities and experiences. And it also seeks to minimize harm in the research process, as well as a methodology that will support research of value to women, people of color, transgender, nonconforming, all of the groups, leading to social change or action that's beneficial to all of these groups. The reason I have women here is I'm talking about the feminist perspective. And so in the bottom note here, I just kind of mentioned that for BiPoc researchers, they've theorized all of this in terms of, all the various groups, marginalized groups. And there are other words that are used to kind of bring that in. And so Bico Agazzino uses the term committed objectivity as a way of understanding how values and scientific research can come together. And Patricia Hill Collins, of course, uses the outsider in perspective, that as outsiders to the goals of these institutions as they were originally established, which for some of us, we weren't even allowed into these institutions originally, that we are now outsiders that are within the institution. And so we have that kind of bifurcated double consciousness, where we have a consciousness of what it means to be an outsider, and we also have that consciousness of what it means to be within, which makes us very powerful in terms of thinking about social change. Okay, and so some examples of institutional ethnographies. One of the main themes in this work is the idea of making the quote unquote invisible visible. And I think that'll be clear to you as I share some of these examples. And so in Marge DeVault's work, she talks about making visible the invisible work of feeding the family. So if you just think about the practice of making a meal and how many women make meals for their families every day, but all of the invisible work that's part of that, going to the store, making sure you have the right shopping list, using your coupons, all of the steps to managing a family and in the end, feeding the family. So is that work of feeding the family leisure? Is it pleasurable, or is it work? And in interviewing women about this work of feeding the family, she found that the words of leisure or work, that kind of dichotomy to be really wanting, to not really be able to describe the actual experience that women were having. And so she came up with this term invisible work. And so many other scholars look at invisible work, such as Mary Romero, looking at the invisible work of housekeeping, and Timothy Diamond investigating the invisible work of nursing and assisted living care, especially when that work is being done by women of color and immigrants. Annette Leroux examines the invisible work of caring for children. And so in our context, the invisible work that many of us participate in as faculty and staff and grad students also is that of advising BiPoc students, which, you know, is that fun, pleasurable, or is it work? Again, the language doesn't quite help us talk about that because many of us, our heart is there and we want to do this work. So is it work or is it pleasure? It's invisible work. The invisible work of over preparing for teaching, especially for women. And so we know that women of color in particular are judged very harshly in teaching evaluations. And so we work overtime to make sure our classes are completely on point because we know that we're setting ourselves up for criticism just by standing in front of the class. Himani Banerjee is a scholar who's written about this extensively. And so that work of over preparing, part of that invisible work. Serving on multiple departmental college and university committees as the only woman of color on the committee, or the only Hispano on that committee, or Chicanx person on that committee, et cetera. And so what the quotes around invisible really point us to is, to whom is this work invisible? And I'll leave that to you to mull. So next, let's talk a little bit about some elements of ethnographies of institutions in higher ed and the Institute for the Study of Race and Social Justice's project to collect race, gender, and social justice curricula across departments. So I'll give a few remarks here and then I'll turn it over to Ruby. And so one of the examples that I would like to call your attention to in terms of ethnographies of universities is what I know best, which is University of Illinois, given I was there almost 20 years. They have an ethnography of the University Initiative, or EUI, and the goal was to preserve student research and deepen the analysis of the university. And it ended up turning into this interdisciplinary pedagogy. And all of the material from this project is in the Ideals database. And so what they did is they designed course assignments to generate entries into the ethnography of the University Initiative. For some reason, that's a mouthful. So I have the link there if you want to look at it for more information. But as we think about the ethnography of UNM, here are some possible elements that we might want to consider. One would be institutional timelines. And so one of the things that we worked on at my prior institution is a social movements timeline, which I found to be actually very helpful in my own research. And so with Kathy Power's project on the Truth Commission, we've started to create a timeline of faculty of color at UNM when we first started teaching here, what kinds of courses we taught, all of the details, and to embed that in a larger timeline of Blacks in New Mexico. The other thing that we can consider as elements of our ethnography of UNM are chronological listings of Black, Latinx, and Hispano, Chicanx, Indigenous women, queer and trans, and faculty with disabilities at UNM, because those numbers are relatively low. And so, you know, they're low enough that we can really trace each of those individuals. The list of BiPoc firsts at UNM is another thing that we can do. And one of the things that's really helpful, and so first let me tell you what that means. And so, for example, who was the first Black student at UNM? Who was the first Chicano student at UNM? Who were the first Indigenous students, et cetera? And first to receive the baccalaureate, master's, and various professional degrees, including doctorate degrees. Who were the first staff, first faculty, students, and staff. And this is so great in terms of creating opportunities for future generations. In our student experience project, one of the things we're learning is that a sense of belonging to UNM and belonging at UNM is important to student success. And so, you know, to assign projects to our students to help them explore these firsts is really helpful. And so in the first year experience courses or in our dual credit courses in the high schools, these would be really great projects to assign, and then also provide entries to the Ethnography of UNM. And so I'm going to stop sharing the screen and turn it over to Ruby to talk about her project.
Yeah, let me pull it up. Give me a second. Okay, so I started this project at the beginning of the semester, and it kind of examines what Dr. Zerai was talking about, analyzing the first, specifically in the sociology, history, and anthropology departments. So for my methodologies, I went through the digital repository of UNM, and I attached a link, and I'm more than welcome to share my presentation if any of you are interested. And I was looking at the catalogs since the university opened, which was in 1892. And my question asks, how diverse in terms of race, gender, and sexuality have courses offered at the University of New Mexico been throughout history? And when I was looking at the catalogs, I was looking for specific keywords, the course names in terms of Latinx, Native American, Black, African American, culture, gender, sexuality, etc. And if the course seemed like it could fit, I would often read the description. And Dr. Lopez and I decided that the most important part of these courses would be the year, course name, course number, number of credit hours, instructor, and course description. So currently, I am working on the Department of Anthropology. I haven't finished. I only made it to the 2000s, but I have found a lot of information. So to begin with the Sociology department, it was founded in 1935 by Paul Walter. And in terms of race, the classes offered were very limited the first 30 to 40 years of the department. The first class to involve race was Migration and Race Problems, which was in 1938, which was fairly new, but classes didn't start going into specific races until the 70s. And that's when we got the first class to specifically address Latinx people, which was Sociology of the Barrio. And a lot of the classes addressed Latin America specifically. They didn't connect it to the United States at all. And the first class to address Native Americans was in 2013, which was Sociology of Native Americans. I'm sure there were classes that, had a week on it that focused on Native Americans or Latinx people, but the first class dedicated to this was until 2013. And in terms of gender, the first class to address gender was Sociology of Sex Roles in 1972. And this is similar across the two other departments that I looked at. And since 1972, there have been 5 courses that address gender, race, or gender, sex, or sexuality. And the newest one was Intersectionality, Race, Gender, class for social policy, which was in 2018. And in terms of faculty, that appears only 8 listed female professors since the department was funded. And some of those are graduate students, not even full-time faculty, which was really surprising. And for the history department, it was founded when the university opened in 1982. The majority of classes addressed European history up until the late 60s. I'd say about 70% of the classes offered in the history department were European history. And the first class to address Native Americans was in 1935, the Indian in North America. And the next was not till 2001, Native American post-1940. And the first class to address people of color in the US specifically was Urban History of the United States in 1967. So it's that same pattern of not till the 60s or 70s, we see these classes being introduced related to the United States. they do have the history of Mexico or the history of Colombia, but directly people of color in the US, it was not talked about until the 60s. And for gender, the first gender class was in 1973, a year after the Sociology department, History of Women from Ancient Times to the Enlightenment. And 16 apparent female professors. And the history department is very big compared to sociology and even anthropology. When I was looking at the course catalogs, I'd say there was about 11 pages worth of history classes offered compared to sociology, which was like 5 or 6. And last, the anthropology department was founded in 1928 by James F. Zimmerman, who our library is named after. Between 1928 to the 1960s, there were not a lot of new classes introduced. The anthropology department was very small up until the 60s. And what was really surprising was that the anthropology department addressed a lot of Native American communities, and only 2 that addressed European countries. And these were classes like Indian art, native languages of America. And these became available in like the late 30s, which was very, very amazing. And gender, they didn't start. What I found interesting was that the anthropology department takes in natural science also with social science. So they were looking at gender and sex. And the first class was in 1973, similar to the history department. And many classes use the word man in the title. They had man in nature, language, culture, and man. Until 1995, the university changed the name to humans and nature. In faculty, I counted 10 female professors. And one that stood out to me was Dr. Ellis. She actually was born in Mexico, and that was in the late 30s. And what I found surprising was that she taught most of the intersectional classes offered in the anthropology department for 20 years. And actually, I did a quick Google search on her, and UNM has a lot of, I guess, like awards and recognize her a lot because she did a lot of research in Taos. So that was really interesting. And to summarize, the 1960s and 70s was when a lot of intersectional courses got added to the catalog. Some courses continue to be on the catalog, like social movements, Spanish-speaking people of the Southwest, and women in modern world, while others were only offered once. So I saw these as the ones that got away. There was a sociology class in Spanish, Seminario de Investigación sobre la Sociedad Mexicana Americana, and then La Raza, History of Mexican Americans and Indian White Relations, Native American Viewpoints. And these catalogs can tell the story, and that's why I think it'd be important if everybody did it for their own department to see what they find out. So, thank you. And I can also share, let me pull up my, the Excel spreadsheet just to give everybody an idea of what it looks like. So I divided it by department, and it was very time consuming, but I think that at the end of the day, like the information that I learned was amazing, and I got to learn a lot about UNM as a whole. And I also color coded it by women professors and classes that stood out to me. Thank you.
That's such amazing work, Ruby. Thank you so much for putting your heart and soul into it. Not just the time, but the heart and the soul. That's what really makes it pop and makes it impactful. So yeah, we're really excited about that. And it is just a perfect example of what we're talking about in terms of the ways that student research can shed light, you know, on the history of the institution and provide us that evidence that we need to call for change in various areas. And so thank you so much. We will have some time for questions at the end. I just have a few more slides I'm going to share. But as you're thinking of questions for Ruby, if you want to go ahead and start to stick those in the chat so she can be thinking about them. And we're looking forward to discussing this with you further, Ruby. Thank you. Okay, so moving along. So one quick thing that I will say, really drawing on what Ruby shared, is that's what's really interesting is if we can take information such as the courses that have been offered through the decades and think about how they line up with historical events happening at that time and political and economic events happening at that time. It's a beautiful way of telling the history, you know, in a multi-layered way of UNM. And so some of the intersecting histories and ethnographies and oral histories, you know, that we can collect and connect to what Ruby had to present would be the histories of people of color in New Mexico, as I mentioned before, and in Albuquerque in particular. So many stories I want to get into, but I'm just going to say the list. The migration history that's connected to New Mexico, of course, the history of education here, and history of various communities of color in politics, because we know our state legislators, for example, have a huge impact on the budgets that many of our ethnic studies and racial and ethnic studies units have access to, as well as our student services. And the history of Black folks, for example, within tribal and Pueblo leadership is very fascinating here in New Mexico, and the history of journalists of color. So to think about how those intersect with the kinds of courses that were being offered, you might find that a particular course spurred an individual to become involved in politics in the state or in journalism, et cetera. So just, you know, such rich information that could create beautiful research going forward. And I'll share an example of how I was inspired by in that way in some of my recent research in a moment. And so in this next section, I'm going to share just a couple of examples of ethnographies of universities and relevant research in higher ed from published studies, as well as to draw from those examples to provide recommendations for future studies in the future of the Ethnography of UNM project. So I'm going to talk about what I know very intimately, which is my own research. So I'll talk about two things here. One, I'll talk about two relevant studies, but then I'll also talk about social action emanating from what's been unveiled in student studies of the histories of institutions. So my book, Intersectionality in Intentional Communities, The Struggle for Inclusivity, was very much inspired by work happening at the University of Illinois. I was looking at campus churches there and their move from being monocultural, white, middle class, conservative to becoming multicultural. And because they were campus churches, of course, they were very much influenced by the politics and education and economics of the University of Illinois in particular. And so for me, I found that the EUI project at the University of Illinois and the University of Illinois' library timelines, especially the social movements timeline that I mentioned earlier, were really critical to helping me understand the context in which this change occurred in these campus churches from the 1940s through the 2000s was the period that I focused on in my book. And one of the churches that I looked at, a Presbyterian church, moved from being, you know, as I said, conservative, white, monocultural to right now, they have a lead pastor who's bisexual female, married to a woman, and they had a Black associate pastor. And so that just reflects something about the change that occurred within that time. And also the church is distinguished as being in the first cohort of those that were conducting marriage ceremonies for queer and trans folks. And so some of what I learned in this research is that, for example, in 1906, Maud L. Brown Bousfield was the first African-American woman to graduate from the University of Illinois. And really interestingly, I have this theory of push and pull factors that I talk about in the book. So push factor toward social inclusion, first Black woman graduate. But in the same year, 1906, the KKK established a student chapter and was recognized as a student organization at the University of Illinois until 1923. So really interesting stuff that I learned. And so as a result of the students' research to unveil these histories at the University of Illinois, they created living and learning communities and named residence halls after these firsts, as I talked about earlier. So there they have the Bousfield Hall, a women's dorm named after the first African-American female graduate, Wassajaw Hall, named after the first Native American graduate, and Nugent Hall, who was named for disability rights activist Tim Nugent. So, you know, even though some of those histories aren't the most social justice promoting, something positive came out of them in terms of these actions that they spurred. And then this is my most favorite example. My good colleague, Vanessa Rouillon, who received her PhD from the University of Illinois, wrote a dissertation on the rhetorical practices of Albert R. Lee. And you see his picture here. And we affectionately refer to him as the unofficial dean of Black students, because back then they didn't have deans of Black students. He started working in the president's office at the University of Illinois in 1897. So just let that sink in terms of what was going on historically in America in 1897. And he was in charge of much of the correspondence coming out of the president's office. And he even would write letters on behalf of the president to people across the world. And so amazing individual. And if that's not enough, in the 1890s, of course, Black students were not allowed to stay on campus at the University of Illinois. And so he personally took it upon himself to connect with all of the Black students who matriculated to the University of Illinois to help them find housing. And there were a number of Black sororities and fraternities established around that time, really into the early 1900s, as a place for Black students to stay, because they were not allowed to stay on campus until 1946, 47. And so, you know, and he worked at the University of Illinois for 50 years, despite all of these amazing accomplishments and contributions really to the institution, he had a gravesite in the cemetery that is right on the University of Illinois campus that did not even have a grave marker. And so Dr. Vanessa Rouillon discovered this when she was doing her research in the English department at Illinois. And she advocated, she brought out this history and she advocated, and we were able to get a tomb marker, you know, a new tombstone for not only him, but his whole family that are buried there. And she also wrote the screenplay of the movie Albert Lee, A Man of Substance. So just beautiful story of bringing that history to the fore. And so what are some considerations for preserving BiPoc history here at UNM? Well, one thing that I've learned through these years is that it really requires systematic and reliable methods to gather information and to share it. And so the UNM's repository is a really great resource. And thanks to Dr. Teresa Neely for providing us some information about this. And we are planning to use the university's repository for our EUNM project. As opposed to the Illinois project, which focuses on student research, we are hoping that our EUNM project will include student, faculty, and staff research. And so, of course, we know Samuel Cisneros has done amazing work on the Adams mural in the Zimmerman Library and published papers about that. And so we definitely would want to include faculty, student, and staff research. A project like this creates avenues for students to share their research, of course. And so I would recommend that we want to host some kind of annual poster session or a student research conference to make sure that our students are able to shine, and that their research doesn't just sit in the archive, but we can really bring it to the fore and inspire new students to do additional research. And then another issue is sustainability. We want to make sure that the entries in the repository are searchable, a la Dr. Neely, who has reminded us this. And also, we want institutional support to sustain the effort. And so I went back to the EUI project that my good colleague had established at Illinois. And unfortunately, she passed away in 2016, 17. The date's not right in my head right now. And then the project kind of stopped. And so we want to make sure that we create some institutional support around this project. So in the decades beyond Dr. Lopez's time here, my time here, Dr. Powers and the rest of Dr. Neely and the rest of us, that this project will live on. So in terms of generating entries, suggestions are for faculty to assign students, especially in qualitative and historical and comparative research methods courses, so that they can create assignments that will, and research that can be added as entries to the EUNM. And also, I've already mentioned that working with students in dual credit and first year courses to complete the FIRSTS project, to learn more about their communities, and like I said before, to enhance that sense of belonging at UNM, that they are not the first, that there are those that have come before them, that have paved the path, and that they are building to that. Very, very helpful. And the benefit, of course, is that it enhances their sense of belonging, as I said, and also, really importantly, it helps to develop their scientist and researcher identities, which we have seen really helps to build that, strengthen that bridge from undergrad to graduate study. And we can talk about other advantages. So potential benefits of the EUNM. This project will celebrate BiPoc scholars and center the analysis and contributions and struggles of our students, faculty, and staff at UNM. And as a minority serving institution in a research intensive context, really UNM is very much about our students, and that minority serving institution designation is resultant from our student demographics. But for us at UNM, it's really about our students and our values. And so we don't want to just be minority enrolling, we want to be minority serving. And that word serving really means a lot to us. And also, really importantly, and I thank Jesse Aleman for helping me understand this better, it's also about our scholarship. And so, as Jesse Aleman has mentioned, from the works of Joy Harjo, Rudolfo Anaya, Erica Sanchez, Denise Chavez, Demetria Martinez, Tay Deanna Rebo, oh gosh, I always trip over this word, Rebolledo.
You got it.
Thank you so much. And many more. It's clear that BiPoc folks have made immense contributions to UNM's footprint within academia and beyond. And so it's about our students, it's about our values, and it's about our scholarship. And so with this project, we really want to bring that scholarship to the fore. We recognize that the conceptual quarantining of the scholarship of faculty of color is not only damaging to those scholars, but it's damaging to our disciplines. We really need to bring that scholarship and highlight it, because it is what will take our disciplines to the next level. And so just a couple more slides here in terms of that social justice impact of a project like this. I'm very proud to report that as a result of Cisneros' article in Azatlan and his other research on the Adams mural and the amazing archive that was put together in the community arts practice, the Zimmerman Library course, where there are 64 YouTube videos capturing lectures about the Adams mural, and research that we're doing as a part of the APLU Student Experience Project that underlines the best practices in the research that shows that environmental cues, such as a mural that represents racial hierarchy, that we really want to communicate through environmental cues that all students belong. And research shows that when we communicate this, that leads to greater student success. And we were also able to draw on, our plans to do the EUNM project. All of that information about the negative impact of the Adams mural helped us to get the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs to approve the occlusion of that mural. And so again, all of this research, not just research for research's sake, but research that is improving the environment here at UNM. And so now is time for discussion and some Q&A and your ideas in terms of next steps. Just thank you so much for taking time to hang out with us today. And thanks for the Institute for Race and Social Justice for inviting us, as well as the Latinx Faculty Alliance and the many other co-sponsors. So I'll stop sharing.
So now is my favorite part, expressing our deep gratitude to VP Assata Zerai and Ruby Angeles Castorena for their amazing work, their inspirational work, and invite all of you to express your gratitude. You have a little reaction button if anyone feels moved. So